Joret Albrecht paid the down payment on her home with money she had saved for 7 years. 4 years later, an envelope arrived with another woman's name on it. When she pulled the county records, she found that her husband had transferred the deed to his ex-wife. The worst part was that her own signature was on the paper. And for 15 months, she had no idea. Her name was Joret Albrecht. She was a bookkeeper in Ashland, Ohio. 11 years of finding numbers that did not add up, accounts that had drifted quietly in the wrong direction, documents that said one thing while meaning another. She never assumed something was fine simply, because nobody had told her otherwise. She looked, always, at everything, and she kept records of what she found, which is why what happened next should have been impossible. She had been married to her husband Lorcan for 4 years. They met at a backyard birthday party, the summer she turned 33. He was tall, easy to talk to, good at making a person feel like the only one in a crowded yard. He sold commercial insurance. He had a smooth explanation for everything and a way of turning small talk into something that felt like real conversation. He made trust feel easy, natural, like the obvious thing. He used to kiss her forehead whenever she finished paying the bills. They dated for 14 months. He proposed on a Saturday morning in the kitchen. No grand gesture, just the ring and the question and her answer. They married the following spring at a small vineyard outside of town. 22 guests. Her older sister Tova cried through the entire ceremony and pretended she wasn't. 9 months after the wedding, they bought the house. It was a 3-bedroom on a quiet street in Ashland. Brick exterior, a backyard with room to grow something. Joret had been saving toward a down payment since she was 26, a number in her head, a threshold, an amount that felt like something that could not be taken in the night. She had reached it on her own, before Lorcan, before the engagement, before any of it. Those savings were hers, built from her income, held in her account, untouched by anyone else. She paid the down payment herself, every single dollar. Lorcan said it made sense that way. His savings were tied up in a business account, he told her, and restructuring would take time. She had no reason to question it. They were married. The money was theirs either way. Or so she believed. Joret handled the paperwork. Lorcan called himself strategically disorganized. She filed the mortgage application. She managed the insurance, the utilities, the taxes. He signed what needed signing, thanked her, and moved on. That was their pattern. She filed it away as division of labor and kept working. Then one Tuesday morning, sorting through the mail, she found an envelope underneath a grocery store circular, addressed in clean printed letters to someone who did not live in her house. Bexley Orne. Their address. Someone else's name. Joret looked at it for a moment. She turned it over. She set it on the counter beside her coffee mug and finished sorting the rest of the mail. Then she went to work. She did not say anything to Lorcan that evening. She made dinner. She asked about his day. She passed the salt. Underneath all of it, one question ran very quietly the whole time. What exactly had her husband done? The envelope sat in a drawer in her home office for 6 days before she opened it. She opened it because it was addressed to someone else at her address, and she needed to understand why. It was a 1-page document from a title company, a standard acknowledgement letter referencing a property transaction, asking the recipient to confirm receipt of a prior filing. The property address was hers. The name on the filing was Bexley Orne. Joret read the page twice. She went to the county assessor's website. In most counties in Ohio, property records are public. You type in the address. The document comes up. She typed in her address. She read what was there. 15 months earlier, during a week she remembered clearly because she had been buried in a demanding client audit, the deed to their property had been amended. A quitclaim transfer had moved Lorcan's ownership share off the record. Not to both of them. Not to Joret. To Bexley Orne, his ex-wife. Joret sat with that long enough for the screen to go dim. She knew what a quitclaim deed did. It moves ownership quickly, quietly, without the other party being notified. One of the fastest ways to reposition a property on paper. She had seen it in client files. She had understood it as a concept. She had never once imagined she would be looking at one with her own name attached. Then she thought about that week. The audit she had been buried in. Lorcan setting a stack of documents in front of her one evening and telling her they were refinancing paperwork, pointing to the signature lines, handing her the pen. She had barely looked up from the work spread across the table. She signed because they were married and she trusted him, and he had told her it was routine. Her signature was on the quitclaim transfer. She had put it there herself, at her own kitchen table, with her own hand, on a document he had told her was something else entirely. She put the paper down, and for a second, she didn't know what to do with her hands. She had been paying for a house that legally was not hers. Some betrayals do not happen in bedrooms. They happen at kitchen tables with a pen in your hand. What would you have done at that moment? Would you have confronted him that night, or would you have waited? She went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists. She looked at herself in the mirror for about 40 seconds. Then she went back to work. Every instinct said to walk downstairs and confront him, to lay the documents in front of him the same way he had laid documents in front of her and watch his face change. There was a version of that evening where she did exactly that. But Joret had spent 11 years building paper trails for people who had been wronged. She knew what happened when someone confronted before they were ready. The other side prepared. They repositioned. They reframed. Confrontation without documentation was theater. It handed the advantage back to the person who had already taken enough. She did not confront. She built. She found an attorney named Aldine Marsh 2 counties, real estate and family law, a one-floor office above a dry cleaner on a state route, a handshake that meant something. Joret paid for the consultation in cash. She told Lorcan she had a client meeting. She laid out the documents in the order they had happened, the down payment records going back 7 years, the deed, the title company letter, the timeline she had reconstructed from memory and bank statements. Aldine read everything carefully. She did not rush. When she finished, she looked up and asked Joret to walk her through the week she had signed the documents. Joret told her. The audit. The stack of papers Lorcan had placed in front of her. The pen. His voice telling her it was a refinancing detail. Aldine asked whether Joret had ever been shown a document called a quitclaim deed and asked to sign it with full knowledge of what it was. Joret told her no. Aldine asked about the mortgage. Joret told her it was in both their names, and that she had been making the payments on time every single month since closing day. Aldine set down her pen and looked at the table between them. So he transferred the asset, but kept you on the liability. Joret looked at her. Yes. Aldine picked up the deed and read it again slowly. He put his ex-wife's name on the deed of a house your money built, using your own signature on a document he misrepresented to you, while keeping your name on the mortgage debt. Yes. Aldine set the document down. That is a significant problem for him. The documentation you have brought me today makes it worse for him at every turn. If you are watching this right now and have not subscribed yet, please do that now. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Whether you are in Ohio, Texas, the UK, Canada, or anywhere else in this world, we want to hear from you. Now let us keep going. Here is what Lorcan had built and why he believed it was solid. He did not think of it as stealing. He thought of it as securing what would eventually be his. Is he evil or just calculated? Hold that question, because what comes next will make it harder to answer. Transfer the house to Bexley before any divorce proceedings could begin. Keep Joret on the mortgage because she was reliable, because she paid on time every single month, because her credit was clean and her habits were automatic. If the marriage ended, the house would belong to Bexley. Joret would walk away with the debt she had been faithfully paying on someone else's property. He would recover the asset through Bexley eventually. Clean and quiet on the surface, it was a plan that only worked if nothing went wrong. One thing had already gone wrong. What he had not accounted for was the trap inside his own plan. Joret was carrying mortgage debt on a property she did not legally own. That meant the bank held a loan against an asset it could not cleanly foreclose or resell. The property could not be sold, refinanced, or transferred again until every name on that mortgage either agreed or was removed by a court order. Every month Joret refused to sign anything. The debt sat on Lorcan's shoulders alone, growing heavier with no exit in sight. He had built the trap to close around her. Instead, it closed around him. And Joret had paid the entire down payment herself, from savings she had built alone, before Lorcan, before the marriage, before any of it. 7 years of her own money had gone into the foundation of that house. A financial contribution trail that predated the marriage itself. That was the entire foundation of the property, sitting in her name, on a bank statement from before the day she ever met him. Joret had no intention of agreeing to anything. Aldine called the financial documentation simply overwhelming. Joret went home, made some food, and she watched television beside Lorcan on the couch while thinking about everything she had just found out. He asked if she wanted to take a trip. He had been thinking about the coast. She told him that sounded nice. Lorcan had a second phone, an old device he kept in the breast pocket of a jacket he wore on weekends. She found it by accident in the inside pocket of that jacket when she was clearing space in the closet. He was at the grocery store. She had maybe 20 minutes. She opened the phone. It was unlocked. She found the thread. 3 people. Lorcan, Bexley, and Dorothea, Lorcan's mother. You need to picture Dorothea before we go any further. A small woman with careful posture and a precise way of speaking. She came to Joret's house for dinner 7 times over the course of the marriage. She sat at Joret's table, ate food Joret cooked, asked about her work, said the house was lovely. She hugged Joret at their wedding. She looked her in the eye and told her she was good for her son. She brought pie to Sunday lunches and asked about the curtains and sat in the living room chair like someone at home. A woman who hugged Joret at her wedding had helped steal her home. Not by accident, not by silence, by choice. She was in that thread, not on the edges, not someone who had stumbled in. She was active. She responded. She asked about timelines. She offered suggestions. She had been there from the beginning, 8 months before the transfer, planning alongside her son and his ex-wife while her daughter-in-law made dinner in the next room. One message from Dorothea, sent the exact week Lorcan brought home the paperwork. Is she going to read all of it carefully? Lorcan replied, she's underwater with work. She'll sign what I put in front of her. Dorothea did not just know. She approved. Sit with that. A mother asking if her daughter-in-law would notice what she was signing. Her son telling her she would not. And her reply, 1 word, good job. From the same woman who had looked Joret in the eye at her wedding and said she was good for her son. There was another message from Bexley 3 months before the envelope arrived. The letter went to your address by mistake. Make sure you get to the mail before she does. Lorcan replied, already on it. He had it covered. Every angle. Or so he believed. The letter did not go to the P.O. box it was supposed to. It came to Joret's house instead. It sat under a grocery circular on a Tuesday morning and she found it. She did not throw it away. She did not set it aside. She filed it. Joret photographed every message with her own phone and emailed the photos to herself immediately, so there was a timestamp on every one. Then she put the jacket back in the closet exactly as she had found it. Lorcan came home with the groceries 20 minutes later. She helped him put things away. She asked if he remembered coffee filters. He said he had forgotten. She said no problem. That evening she drove 40 minutes out of Ashland to her sister's house. Tova was Joret's older sister by 4 years. She lived on a property she shared with her husband and their 2 dogs. She did not panic. She did not fill silences. Joret sat at her kitchen table. Tova made tea. Joret did not drink it. She told her everything, from the very beginning. The envelope, the deed, her own savings as the down payment, her own signature on a transfer she had not known she was signing, the second phone, the thread, Lorcan's message, Dorothea's reply. She told Tova about the baby. When Joret finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long period. Tova looked at the table between them. Then she reached across and put her hand over Joret's and held it there. She did not pull away. She did not reach for something to say. She just held on. She did not ask why Joret had stayed quiet. She did not say she could not believe it. Tova looked at her. Tell me what you need. Joret told her she needed 9 weeks and silence. Tova gave her both. For 9 weeks, Joret lived normally. She paid the mortgage on time. She made dinner. She attended Lorcan's company event in week 4 and stood beside him and talked to his colleagues and smiled the right amount and laughed at the right moments. Nobody in that room knew what was sitting quietly underneath that evening. She shook hands with people whose names she would never remember and answered questions about her work and drove home beside Lorcan in the dark without saying anything that mattered. Dorothea came for a Sunday lunch in week 6. She brought pie. She set it on Joret's counter and said the house looked wonderful. She asked about the new curtain in the hallway and said she loved the color. She sat in the same chair and ate from the same plates and complimented the food, and asked about Joret's work clients and looked her in the eye the whole time. Joret passed her the pie server. She looked at that woman across her own table and answered every question and did not let a single thing show. Inside, she was building a case none of them could see. She documented every mortgage payment going back to closing day, with dates and account records. Every home improvement receipt going back for years. The water heater she paid for out of her own account when the old one failed in year 2. The roof repair in year 3. The kitchen renovation she had funded entirely herself while Lorcan's money had been quietly redirected elsewhere. She built a paper record of contributions so complete and so dated that Aldine would later tell her she had never seen documentation this thorough from someone who had not been advised in advance to collect it. She had always kept everything. He had known that about her. He had just miscalculated which direction it would eventually point. She also wrote down every message from that thread, organized chronologically, dated carefully. The earliest message was from 8 months before the quitclaim transfer. 8 months before a single document was placed in front of her. Before she picked up the pen. Before she signed her name on something she did not know she was signing. 8 months of planning, of coordination, of 3 people in a thread deciding what to do with a 4th person's home, while that 4th person made their dinners and paid their bills and trusted that she understood the life she was living. 8 months. While Joret paid the bills and filed the taxes and made the dinners and trusted that she understood the life she was living, the 3 of them had been in a thread deciding what to do with her home. Her house, her down payment, her name on the mortgage, her money keeping the whole thing afloat while they planned how to take it from her. She went back to Aldine in week 2 with the phone photographs. Aldine said the messages changed everything. A misrepresented signature alone was one thing. A coordinated plan involving 3 people, documented in writing months in advance, was something the courts treated very differently. Then Aldine asked about Bexley's finances, whether Bexley had used any property as a financial reference on a recent loan application. Joret told her she didn't know. Aldine picked up her pen. She would find out. What she found was this. Bexley had listed the Ashland property as her primary asset on a business loan application and used it as collateral. The loan had already been approved. The house froze. The bank stepped in. Nobody could move anything. Every month, the pressure got worse. He had built a plan that only worked if nothing went wrong. He knew they were trying for a child. He knew what a pregnancy would change, the obligations it would create, the legal ties it would extend, the complications it would introduce into any proceeding. A child would mean years of entanglement. A child would make the clean exit he had been engineering considerably less clean, which meant this was not something he had done impulsively. He planned it, and then he waited for her to sign. That night she had gone home and lay in the dark. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She had found out 11 days earlier. She had not told him yet. She had been waiting for what felt like the right moment, some quiet evening where it felt safe to say the thing out loud. And he had already been planning how to leave her with nothing. Have you ever trusted someone completely and later realized they had been calculating the whole time? Drop your answer in the comments. You are not alone. She thought about the forehead kiss. How many evenings she had sat at that table paying bills while he stood behind her. How many times that small gesture had landed without question. She sat in the dark and thought about every ordinary evening she had gone to sleep in a house that did not belong to her. Every morning she had made coffee in a kitchen that another woman's name was attached to on a county record she had not known to check. Every bill she had paid. Every month she had kept that mortgage current without missing once. She held the pregnancy close and kept moving. On a Wednesday morning, Joret filed. She flagged the title discrepancy with the mortgage lender and requested a full chain of title audit on the property. Through Aldine's office, she filed a formal legal challenge to the quitclaim transfer on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. She did not call Lorcan first. She did not warn Bexley. She went straight to the institutions that held the financial weight of what had been done. Bexley found out first. She tried to draw against the business loan and was told the collateral was frozen. She called Lorcan immediately. Joret was in the kitchen when his phone rang. He walked to the back porch. She watched him through the window. She watched his posture change the moment he understood what he was being told. She watched him pace the length of the porch twice, stop, run one hand through his hair, and pace it again. He stood at the railing for a moment, looking at the yard. Then he paced it a third time. He came back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway, his jaw tight. "Did you file something?" Joret was making coffee. She did not turn around immediately. She finished pouring. Then she turned. She did not raise her voice. She already knew how it ended. "I flagged a discrepancy in the deed. Were you aware there was a discrepancy?" He stared at her. She watched him calculating, measuring exactly how much she knew. She watched him weigh 3 possible approaches: confess, deflect, or attack, and settle on the middle one. He crossed his arms. "We need to talk about the house." She picked up her coffee. "I think we probably do." What came next was not a scene. No screaming. No dramatic confession. No moment where he finally looked her in the eye and told the truth. The people who build these arrangements do not collapse when they are caught. They calculate. They look for the angle that gives them room to move. Lorcan calculated for 4 months and came up with nothing. He stopped explaining things after that. For the first time in their marriage, he had nothing to say. He called an attorney the next morning. Joret was already 3 weeks ahead of him. His position was impossible from the first day. He could not claim ignorance because his own signature was on the transfer. He could not claim Joret had consented because the documented record showed deliberate misrepresentation. The phone thread showed prior planning across 8 months. Dorothea's messages showed active coordination. Bexley's loan application showed a third party had accepted and leveraged the asset with full knowledge of what it was. He could not remove Joret from the mortgage without her agreement. He could not sell the property. He could not transfer it. He could not do anything at all. Every month the debt sat there, due and unpayable, with no exit and no relief. The property he had thought would give him everything became the thing that cost him everything. Month after month, the invoices arrived. His credit cracked. His attorney billed. And Joret's name remained exactly where it was, on the mortgage, immovable, patient, waiting. Every single month the mortgage payment came due. He paid it alone for 4 months. Joret had separated her finances in week 2, through Aldine's guidance. She was within her rights. Her credit remained clean. His did not. Bexley's position was worse. She had accepted a property not cleanly transferred from a marriage she was not party to. Her business loan sat against an asset she could not prove she legitimately owned. The lender opened a separate inquiry. The business she had been building for 2 years, funded on the back of Joret's house and Joret's down payment and Joret's 7 years of savings, collapsed under the legal pressure. She had taken something that was not hers, used it to build something for herself, and watched the entire structure come apart when the foundation turned out to have someone else's name on the mortgage. Every dollar of credit she had drawn against that asset came back due. Gone. Dorothea had no direct legal exposure, but she had been named in the documentation as a participant in the coordination. Her messages were part of the formal evidentiary record. The message asking whether Joret would read carefully. The reply telling her she would sign what was put in front of her. Her one-word response. All of it dated. All of it time-stamped. All of it sitting in a file with her name on it. All of it in a file. Good. Joret thought about her sometimes. The pie in week 6. The curtain she asked about. All those evenings at that table, asking about Joret's clients, complimenting the food, looking her in the eye. Every single one of those evenings she had known exactly what that house was worth to someone else and said nothing. The settlement came in the 5th month. The terms were confidential. The numbers were not the point. Joret walked away with a full financial recovery accounting for her down payment, for years of mortgage contributions, and every dollar of her money that had ever touched that property. Her name was removed from the mortgage cleanly and permanently. The title dispute was resolved by the courts. She walked out of the proceedings the same way she had walked into the first consultation with Aldine. Without drama, with everything documented, Lorcan and Bexley were left to untangle what remained between them. Bexley's business loan was called in. The business she had been building for 2 years, funded entirely on the back of Joret's house and Joret's 7 years of savings, collapsed when the lender's inquiry stripped it of its collateral. It was gone before she had time to save it. Lorcan is renting somewhere outside Ashland. He had spent months building a plan to leave Joret with nothing. He had recruited his ex-wife and his own mother. He had studied Joret closely enough to know exactly when she would not be paying attention and moved in that window. He had kissed her forehead after she paid his bills. He had handed her documents and called them routine. He had sat across from her at dinner for months knowing exactly what he had already done. He thought he had thought of everything. When the settlement papers landed on his attorney's desk, he sat in that office for a long time without speaking, not calculating anymore, just sitting with what it had cost him. He did not think of it as stealing. He thought of it as securing what would eventually be his. He had lived comfortably inside that framing for months. That distinction mattered to him. It did not matter at all to the courts. In the end, he was the one paying debt on a property he could not touch, living in a rental while invoices piled up from an attorney he could no longer afford. He built a trap and walked into it himself. Dorothea still lives in the same house she has lived in for 30 years. The same house she left every Sunday to come sit at Joret's table and ask about her curtains and say the house was lovely and look her daughter-in-law in the eye without flinching. Joret did not reach out to her. She had nothing to say. Lorcan was told about the pregnancy in the 7th month of the proceedings, formally, through Aldine's office, as required. His attorney received the disclosure. He did not say another word on the drive home that evening. Joret's daughter was born in the spring. Tova was in the room. She cried, without apology, without pretending, without bothering to wipe her face until it was completely over. Joret held her daughter, and for the first time in many months, nothing was being taken from her. Nothing was being moved. Nothing was being signed away without her knowledge. Just the weight in her arms and the quiet in that room, and something that belonged to her completely. Her daughter has never been inside the Ashland house. Joret refused to let her first memory be inside a home built on betrayal. She refused to carry her daughter into the same walls where her own signature had been turned against her, where Dorothea had sat and eaten and smiled and known everything, where Lorcan had kissed her forehead and thanked her for paying a mortgage on a property he had already handed to someone else. So she started again, smaller, quieter, hers. Joret did not lose the house, but she lost the version of herself that believed love made paperwork safe. That version trusted a stack of papers because the man who handed her the pen had kissed her forehead and called her his wife. That version believed that being careful with everyone else's records meant she was protected in her own home. That version thought trust and attention were the same thing. They were not. He had used the trust to neutralize the attention. And for 15 months, across every ordinary evening, across every bill she paid and every dinner she made and every morning she woke up in a house she was funding with her own money, it had worked exactly as he planned. That version is gone. What replaced her is quieter, more careful, harder to surprise, and very difficult to catch off guard. There are people in this world who build these arrangements. The quiet deed transfers, the documents that look routine. The group chats where 3 people sit in a thread and discuss what to do with a 4th person's home. Every single one of them counts on the same thing. They count on you not reading what you sign. They count on love being a reason not to look too closely. They count on the bills getting paid and the table getting set and nobody ever going to the county website and typing in their own address. They count on the fact that when someone hands you a pen and tells you what to sign, you believe them. Check your name now. Not tomorrow morning. Not when something first feels wrong. Today. Because by the time something feels wrong, it may already be sitting quietly in a file somewhere with your name on the wrong line. One envelope went to the wrong address on an ordinary Tuesday morning in Ashland, Ohio. and landed in the hands of the one person in that house who read everything and kept records of what she found. One woman read it carefully and completely, and 3 people who believed she was completely asleep found out she had been documenting everything. If you enjoyed this story, share it with someone. Someone you know right now is trusting the wrong person. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.